Hey guys, it's Jasma, and today we're going to make a lime and coconut cake. Coconut is one of my favorite flavors, and I love the combination of it with lime. It is a little bit citrusy, and it is nice and refreshing. So let's get started. First, preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm going to quickly explain my cake pans. So today I'm using two 6-inch removable bottom cake pans, so you could take the bottom out. And I have placed on a piece of parchment paper. You do not need to oil the pan at all because this cake doesn't particularly stick to the cake pan. And I'm also going to be using some baking strips. So what this is basically you soak it in cold water so it slows down the cooking process of the outer layer of cake so that the center and the rest the sides of the cake bake evenly so it doesn't have a huge dome. It basically comes out of the oven nice and flat so you don't have to cut off too much of the cake. You have to soak it in cold water. Be sure to prepare this ahead of time so that it is thoroughly soaked and it doesn't burn in the oven. I got this at Michael's. You should be able to find it in any baking store or craft store. Make sure you do this beforehand because you really want these to be nice and evenly soaked. First off, preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit so that it's nice and ready to go. And then we're going to mix together our dry ingredients. So I have some all-purpose flour here. I'm going to add in the salt, baking soda, and baking powder. Just briefly mix this together, and then we're going to pass it through a sieve. This gets rid of any lumps inside of the flour and introduces air, which allows the cake to be nice and fluffy. Now we're going to add in the fine coconut flakes. This adds a ton of flavor to the cake. Just briefly mix that through. The dry ingredients are ready to go, so now we can zest and juice our lime. You're going to need the zest from one lime. Try to get it as fine as possible because you don't want a huge clump of the zest inside of your cake because it could taste a little bit bitter. Make sure you keep rotating the lime because the white rind is quite tart and you don't want to get that in the cake. Now we could juice the lime. So you always want to make sure that when you're squeezing juices from lemon, oranges, or lime, you could roll it around so that you break out the pulp inside of the lime so that it releases more of its juices. And another way to get more of the juice, then take a fork and poke at the lime. This once again breaks up the pulp and releases more of its juices. Measure out 2 tablespoons of the juice. Now we can move on to our wet ingredients. So I moved over to my stand mixer just to make everything easier, but of course you can do this by hand. I'm using a paddle attachment, and to my bowl I'm going to add in both types of my oils. Today I'm using 2 types of oils, coconut oil and regular flavorless oil. You do not want to all use coconut oil because it does solidify when it becomes cold, and I don't want this cake to become hardened when I refrigerate it. So I'm also going to be using a portion of regular oil so it still stays nice and soft. So I'm just going to add them to my bowl. The coconut oil I melted down and allowed it to cool. You don't want to use burning hot coconut oil in this cake. Add in the white sugar, vanilla extract, and sour cream. The sour cream packs in all of the moisture and it also makes this cake nice and fluffy. Give that a quick mix. Once combined, crack in all 4 eggs. Mix that until combined. Then add in the dry ingredients. Mix until just combined. Add in the lime zest and juice. Mix until combined. Give the sides of the bowl a scrape just to make sure everything is thoroughly mixed through. And then mix for around 10 more seconds. You can see there are some bubbles forming in the batter. That is the baking powder and baking soda reacting to the sour cream and the lime. So make sure to work fast from now on. The cake batter is now ready. I have already placed my even baking strips on my cake pans, and you want to get it into the oven as soon as possible because these baking soda and baking powder are already activating to the sour cream and the lime juices, so you want to get it into the oven before it deactivates or it won't be as soft and fluffy. So I'm just going to distribute it between the two pans evenly. And you will find that your batter is a little bit bubbly and you'll see air bubbles in it. That is the leavening agents activating to the acid in this cake. Make sure you do not overbeat the batter or it will toughen up the cake. Try to get it as even as possible between the two cake pans. Bang this on the counter just a couple of times to release any huge air bubbles. Now place these into the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 to 15 minutes, but it will vary depending on the size of your cake pan, and every oven is different, so make sure you test it, but with a toothpick. If it comes out clean, that means it is done. And it should be nice and golden brown on top as well. My cake has baked and cooled completely. Now it is very important that you let it cool or it will melt the frosting when we decorate it. So I'm going to take it out of the pan by running a butter knife or a spatula around the sides just to loosen it up. I'm going to remove the baking strip, flip it out onto a cooling rack. You can see how evenly this cake has baked. Rub the sides of the cake to get rid of any extra crumbs. This just makes it easier for later when you're decorating it. I'm going to cut these cakes in half, so I have 4 layers in the end, but you could cut it into however many layers you want. I'm using my cake leveler, but of course you could just use a regular serrated knife. Now we can move on to making the frosting and the decorations. So today I'm going to be making a lime whipped frosting. You can do whatever frosting you like, of course. So I'm going to be zesting 1 more lime. And it is very important that you zest it nice and finely so that it's not very long pieces of zest, because you don't want huge clumps of this inside of your frosting. You'll need about half a tablespoon of this lime zest. You can of course add more or less depending on how you'd like it. And then I'm going to juice this lime. Measure out 1.5 tablespoons of this lime juice. You don't want too much lime juice or it will separate the whipping cream since it is acid and it will break up the fat inside of the cream. So this is just about the right amount to have that nice and refreshing lime flavor and give it a little bit of sourness inside of the frosting. Then I'm going to slice some lime slices thinly, and this is just for decoration, which is of course optional. This is going to be placed on top of the cake in the end, so I don't want any excess juice leaking onto the frosting, which is why I'm going to place on a piece of kitchen towel so that it soaks up any excess juices. I'm going to fold this and make it sort of like a ruffle on top of the cake, but of course you can decorate it however you want. I moved over to my stand mixer once again. Of course you could use a hand mixer, but I wouldn't suggest you to do this by hand. So I have a whisk attachment and I'm going to pour into the bowl some cold, heavy whipping cream. If it's cold, it makes it easier to whip up and it's more stable, so I would suggest you to refrigerate this ahead of time. It has become slightly thickened, so I'm going to add in half of my lime juice and half of my icing sugar. I'm scraping down the sides of the bowl to mix in all the icing sugar that is splashed onto the sides. Now add in the rest of the lime juice, rest of the icing sugar, and the lime zest. And now whisk until stiff peaks form. Alright, the frosting is ready, so now we can assemble the cake. To assemble the cake, I have a turntable. This just makes everything a lot easier, but if you don't have it, it's fine. It should turn out just the same. So I'm going to lay a little bit of the frosting on the bottom just to stick the cake down so it doesn't move around too much when I'm decorating. Then place their first layer on top, and then lay on a generous amount of frosting. Spread it out nice and evenly. Place on your next layer of cake. Try to get it nice and centered. And just repeat that process until you run out of cake layers. Now I'm just going to smooth out the sides and fill in the gaps between the cake layers. Usually I'm a fan of naked cakes, but today I'm going to cover the entire thing with frosting. I switched over to a cake scraper to make it easier. I have a nice and thick layer of frosting on the outside of my cake. You can no longer see through it, so I'm just going to take a small offset spatula and we're going to run around the sides to create some texture. And this allows the cake to be nice and rustic, so it does not have to be perfectly smooth and perfectly straight on the edges. When I first started cake decorating, I found it really difficult to get it perfectly smooth, to get a nice finish, so I found that this technique is really simple for beginner cake decorators because it does not have to look perfect, but it still looks nice. Having a turntable makes this technique a lot easier to do, and if you plan on cake decorating very often, I would totally suggest you to get one because it just makes everything so much easier. The cake is frosted, so now we could garnish it with the lime slices that I've already prepared. So I slice them nice and thinly so that they're flexible, which makes it easier for me to arrange on top of the cake. Just sprinkling on a little bit of lime zest to add an extra touch to this cake. And now as a final step, I'm going to press on some toasted coconut around the side of the cake. And of course this is optional, but I feel like it adds a little bit to this cake and makes people know that it's a lime and coconut cake. So for the toasted coconut, you could toast it in an oven, or I just placed it into a pan and stirred it around until the coconut started to brown. Going to really gently almost throw the coconut onto the cake to give it a really random look. Take a tissue paper or a pastry brush and just get rid of the excess coconut. But be careful not to scrape the actual cake. Alright, that's how you make this lime and coconut cake. You can see the decoration really adds a lot to this cake. It's quite refreshing as well. And the cake itself is moist and very fluffy, and it has a nice texture. So I really hope you could try this out. It does have a few steps to it, but it is definitely worth it. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next time. Bye! Coconut is one of my favorite flavors, and I love the combination of it with the lime. It makes a nice and refreshing. It is nice and refreshing, and we're going to decorate it to look good. The cold water slows down the process of the baking. The cold water slows the sides of the cake. The cold water slows down the process of cooking. The cold water slows the sides of the cake down while it's cooking so that it could bake evenly with the center of the cake as well. Without this, the sides of the cake cooks first and then the center bakes, so it basically creates it's so hard to explain this. This makes sure that the entire cake bakes nice and evenly, so you won't have to cut away any of the dough and you won't waste any of the cake.